we have given great attention to the protection of Ashraf residents since the first attack they suffered in July 2009. But we fight against time. But the Iranian regime and its Iraqi allies oppose to this European solution and are trying to forcibly displace the residents of Ashraf inside Iraq. I want to conclude by saying that we need to get immediate protection for Ashraf. These 1,000 women and more than 2,000 men cannot feel safe with all these Iraqi soldiers and officers who have already murdered 35 of them in April. Thank you for your attention, and now I would like to give the floor to the President of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, our very good friend, Mrs. Mariam Rajavi.
Thank you. Dear friends, first I would like to welcome the decision by the Council of Ministers on Monday to work with the UN and US to find a lasting solution for the humanitarian crisis in Ashraf. We welcome the plan presented by the European Parliament delegation for relation with Iraq. The European Parliament initiative also underscores that immediate security of the residents is the absolute requirement of a viable and peaceful solution. To avoid another tragedy, the EU should, in conjunction with the US and the UN, take immediate measures to protect the residents of Camp Ashraf. Under the circumstances, I warn that any forcible relocation is a prelude to massacre the residents. In light of the Council of Ministers discussion on Monday, I ask Baroness Ashton to take all necessary measures to implement the plan proposed by the European Parliament. I also call on her to urge the UN to station a monitoring team in Ashraf and make the necessary arrangements in this regard to avert another massacre. The European Union and Baroness Ashton have the power and the means to do that, especially based on the principle of responsibility to protect R2P, which is currently being used in Libya and Cote d'Ivoire to protect civilians. I also ask the US, which has signed an agreement with each resident, to protect them, to respect its obligations, and undertake the necessary steps to guarantee the protection of the residents. It's time to adopt a firm position and recognize the Iranian opposition. Thank you all very much.
Do we need any further evidence on what we've just seen? Such cruelty, savagery, barbarity. We simply have to bring this to an end. And it is for this reason, distinguished guests, that I wish to add my wholehearted support to the European Parliament's proposal, which is called the Stevenson Plan, to solve the crisis once and for all. However, in the meanwhile, the protection of the residents must be guaranteed by United Nations-led force. The international community, led by the EU, must now demand that a UN-led team take control, as Madam President has said, over the protection of the camp. Any attempt to talk of displacement within Iraq must be immediately resisted and quashed. The international community, as has already been said, led by Baroness Ashton, President Obama and others, must now at last throw its weight behind the European Parliament's proposal to protect the residents. I also want to use this opportunity to call on the United States government to follow the example of Europe and remove the name of the PMOI from its black list.
Let me talk first of all about moral obligations, and I hope Washington understands this. They have a moral obligation here, a direct moral obligation. If you saw that video, every single one of those slaughtered before our eyes on that video was carrying a personal certificate signed by Washington, promising to secure their protection in the future. And if this gets worse, ladies and gentlemen, and my view is it will, then there is a terrible burden of moral obligation that rests at Washington's door. My second point, Mr. Chairman, and not wishing to go on for too long, is the legal position here. Well, there are those who argue, and I'm one of them, that these refugees have the direct protection of the Fourth Geneva Convention for Refugees. It is said that they were granted the protections of the Fourth Geneva Convention because the place was at war, but once the fighting finished, that protection is removed. I can find no legal precedent for that concept. The refugees in Bosnia had the protection of the Fourth Geneva Convention. That did not end, as Wes Clark will remember, when the war finished. It ended when the condition of those refugees was assured. And then there is a second issue, which I think Washington does understand, that it is illegal, allow me to say this again, it is illegal under international law to forcibly relocate refugees. It can only be done on a voluntary basis. Let me just remind you, if anybody, Iraq or anybody else, were to act to forcibly relocate these people, they would be acting in direct contravention of international law, and anybody who aids and abets that process by standing aside when they could stop it is at least party to that act. It would require only a monitoring team in there to prevent this happening. Now, I hope that could be done by the UN. I find it impossible to understand why the UN refuses to do this. I'm told it's because the UN consider it too dangerous. I mean, I thought the UN was there to protect others from danger, not to protect itself from danger. But if it requires the United States detachment to provide protection for that, then let it happen, but let it happen soon. And I hope that the European Union, I hope Baroness Ashton, with whom I spoke earlier today on this matter, will now use the full power of the European Union to persuade the UN to take that action. If that doesn't happen, but it's very much a second best, then I hope the European Union will step in and do it itself.
I spent 38 years in uniform. I helped negotiate the peace agreement in Bosnia with Richard Holbrooke, and I was the NATO commander, and I think I know a war crime when I see it. And I think there should be an immediate action taken by the International Criminal Court to investigate what happened at Ashraf. Above and beyond everything else, this has the appearance of a war crime. And it needs to be dealt with properly and legally. But I've seen no evidence that this is a terrorist organization. I've asked for this. None has been presented. I can see no reason why they should remain on the foreign terrorist organization list. None. After the 8th of April, people inside the government of the United States began talking about the inside Iraq relocation as a temporary alternative until an outside Iraq solution could be developed. Well, that solution has been developed. It's here in the European plan. And I think that it should be supported, not only by European governments, but also by the United States. And I commend the European Parliament and its delegation and Stern Stevenson for leading this effort, and for Patty Ashdown as well, to make this happen. I also endorse the idea of a UN team, and I would like to suggest that this would be an ideal opportunity for the European Union to take leadership in providing the resources for this team. How can a group of 4,000 women and 2,000 men who are disarmed in a camp inside Iraq attract such focus from the Iranian government that they would put so much pressure on worldwide to attack this group? This group could be the key to opening the third way of dealing with the crisis in Iran that is surely coming. Preserving these people and recognizing the extraordinary influence that they have, obviously, is not only a humanitarian imperative, it is a strategic imperative. Thank you.
For saying yes, the MEK received a promise of protection from the United States, a protection that was recognized by the United Nations. It was a very important commitment understood by the United Nations. Unfortunately, the United States and the United Nations did not keep their end of the bargain. I believe that the MEK did keep their end of the bargain, and that they are allies in the war on terror. We do have a moral obligation as a people. I think I have a moral obligation as an American to call attention to the problem and help to better understand the solutions. And again, the solutions will not be easy. And I compliment Representative Stevenson for the solution that you put forward and that the European Parliament has called attention to. But it's an important solution that should be considered.
We can't just continue talking and wishing. So the first step that I think has to be looked at is obviously that the European Union has taken the lead. And I believe we need to follow you. The other alternative that I heard of moving them around military bases in Iraq makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. I don't know why it's even on the table. And so what I believe we need is a combined effort of the European Union taking the lead. And I'm not saying the United States government should not participate. Obviously, we should, but we're a little behind on the policy. Get the United Nations, get some military strategists to come up with some ways that we can provide some of this protection.
The United Nations must therefore say that it will do what it can to prepare the way for such a resettlement and accept the responsibility. The United Nations would then request protection from the United States forces. So the way the issue would be framed is the UN will do its best, and the UN has lodged a request to the United States government to provide protective forces for its mission in Ashraf that is taking the names. That will put U.S. troops back in Ashraf on the scene. That's the indispensable thing. Now you'll notice that I think an interim step of moving them someplace else in Iraq preparatory to this will actually be a huge and very costly diversion of energy that actually will make the problem harder to solve.
The terror listing must be stopped, and that's a message for Secretary Clinton. Take the MEK off of the list immediately. It is within her capability and hers alone. It is an executive branch authority. But please listen. There is an alternative, a middle way that will dramatically affect Iran, distract them from their unacceptable adventures, and potentially create a regime change, a democratic regime change in Iran. This middle way is merely the support of the Iranian opposition. We can and should do so. The second is the protection of the residents of Camp Ashraf in accordance with the Geneva Convention, in which the residents are designated as protected persons. This protection should be led by the UN, UNAMIN, and security provided by the U.S. troops that would go to Camp Ashraf. Second, U.S. diplomats are recommending an internal relocation of the MEK and Camp Ashraf deeper into Iraq. This is really totally unacceptable. It is not a solution, whether it's temporary or permanent, if it stays inside Iraq. In closing, we Americans as a nation must focus on our key objective, Iran. The MEK is the best dissident group, the best resistance group to prevail over the mullahs in Iran. Let's delist the MEK now. As the Arab Spring grows, let it this time be different. This time we must have a regime change to a democratic society in Iran.